Understanding setting in your screenplay is a relatively simple thing, but understanding the implications of setting, that's a whole new level. If you're gonna take the time to tell a story, then tell a story that matters. When most writers think of budgetary implications for their script, they tend to default to the plot elements. A car chase, an explosion, or 97 of them if you're Michael Bay, or a foot chase through a crowded public space. And while those things individually do impact the budget, the plot elements are not where you should be spending your time if you need to cut the budget. And here's why this matters. As I record this in 2022, the big budgets for movies are reserved for movies that are based right now on pre-existing intellectual property, or IP. If you're making a Marvel movie, a DC movie,
I'm Batman,
Star Wars movie, or a sequel to anything that did well, the budget goes up, some cases way up. But for you, a new writer, having a bigger budget movie that you're trying to shop, that's just a tough path.
I'm Batman.
Now, can you sell or option that script? Well, possibly. And the bigger the implied budget of your script, the more likely the script is just going to be optioned instead of outright purchased, which could still happen later.
Hey babe, what? Let's hold hands.
And if you ultimately want to write those types of movies, it's good to have one or two in your arsenal if someone happens to ask you that lovely, wonderful question, what else have you got? But your chances of breaking in are much, much higher if you're writing a lower budget film. And by lower budget, I mean anything that could be shot for under $2 million or so, maybe $5 million, but you want to kind of keep it low.
Hey guys, I think we're about to crash into the sun.
Yeah, but it's gonna look really cool.
But Jake, you say, I don't know how much things cost, so how can I understand the budget? And that's a valid question, and I'm going to circle back to it, I promise. But we need to lay some groundwork first so we're all on the same page. And then the answer to that question I'm going to give you will make a whole lot more sense. And since we're talking about budget, I want to mention something I've recently launched, which is 100% free. I spoke to several of you in January of this year, and one thing that came up regularly in our discussions was how hard it was for you to write every day, that you wanted some motivation to help cultivate a habit of working on the craft regularly. Now, some of you wanted to write every day, but you didn't know what to write or what to work on. And to fill this gap, I've created a 100% free 30-day jumpstart. 30 days of writing prompts and exercises to help you cultivate a habit of regular writing. There's a link below where you can get more information about that and sign up for free. Seriously, there's no catch. I want to help you improve in the craft, and I know that that free resource will be helpful for you. There's also some other links below that you might find helpful, and if at any point you find value, don't forget about all of the fun buttons, and hitting all of those are free too. But for budgetary implications of setting, we need to back all the way up and talk about what we mean by setting. The setting of your film, and right now I'm talking about the broad film, okay, the whole film. The setting refers to where your story takes place, and it refers to when the story takes place. Setting always refers to both where and when. The where, okay, that's relatively simple. I mean, New York City, Paris, a small town in Kentucky, the Alaskan wilderness, Amazon jungle, an island in the Pacific. And if your story jumps around to many locations, you could, if pressed, talk about those locations broadly, like the Star Wars universe or the Marvel universe, for example. But where the story takes place is only half of the setting, because a story set in New York City in 2022 is going to look and cost very different than a story set in New York City in the 1940s. Or what about New York City in the late 1800s? All are in New York City, but the time significantly impacts the setting. And the setting, just in these terms, where and when, is relatively easy to understand. But what's more expensive? Modern New York City, or 1940s New York City, or 1880s New York City? Or what about 23rd century New York City? Well, the cheapest is going to be modern day. I mean, you're not gonna have to worry about background or props or costumes for extras, or at least not as much, but all of the others are going to be about as expensive. Doesn't really matter when. I mean, yes, one might have more CG and another you might have to rent more expensive props, and the other is older so you can get away with some things, but as soon as you step away from a modern day time in your setting, you're going to be racking up the dollars. Does this mean you have to eliminate all of those scenes from your script? Well, no. Just realize that the more you keep, the more expensive the setting is going to be, unless your whole movie takes place in a setting that can be recreated or built. And that's really where the cost starts to be impacted, because if you can build or fabricate a set, it's a little cheaper. I mean, this is why Westerns are still popular. They can build or fabricate an Old West town, and then any indoor settings they can build on a lot or on a soundstage. And because of using the same set over time, they can save a lot of money. And this is even more true with TV shows than movies, because TV shows can revisit the same location multiple times. These revisited locations are called standing sets. And if you watch any TV show, you'll notice that over several episodes, about 40 of the sets remain the same from episode to episode. They might get an upgrade between seasons, but if you build a set and only use it once, that's expensive. The more you use the same set, the cheaper it is. And while built sets can reduce the overall costs, especially if your entire film takes place within those, that's about as far as most writers think about how setting impacts the budget. Well, nope. Let's go back to our definition of setting: where and when the story takes place. Now, what I've been talking about is the broad story itself, but you also have to consider the individual scenes and moments and actions within each scene. Now, I'm going to be very general as I talk about this, and you need to realize that part of the job of the key people on a film, the producer, director, cinematographer, set designer, is to find solutions to problems. And at its most basic level, that's what filmmaking is, really. It's just solving problems. You solve enough problems, you have a film. And often those problems are related to budget. The director wants to do this, but they only have this much money. Blank is too expensive. Okay, so what if instead they do that? Because that is cheaper and will still garner the same emotional response from the audience. Cool, let's do that. And writers often think they can just write whatever they want and all of those problems will just be sorted out later in pre-production when those key people are talking about and trying to solve those problems. But what you've just done is created a bunch of work for them. And doing this makes it seem like you aren't a team player, that you aren't concerned about other things. And this is a fine line, so please hear me on this. Your job is to write the best story you can write while taking into consideration the impact your words are gonna have on other people who work on the film. And at times, if you ever get your script sold and it goes into production or is about to get into production, you may be asked to do a rewrite that reduces the overall budget. And you're thinking, well, can't the producer and director sort that out? Well, yeah, they could, but if you do it, that makes their job easier, and that's what you want. You want it to be easy for the reader to recommend your script. You want it to be easy for the producer to find money because they don't have to find as much. You want the production designer to spend time being creative with set, prop, and costume design and not hunting down and negotiating contracts for vintage automobiles. Part of your job as a screenwriter is not just about crafting a good story and telling it well. It's also to help make everyone else's job easier. And that's one reason scripts are formatted the way they are, by the way, so don't go making it difficult for everyone just because you think 23 explosions will be cool. I mean, they might be cool, but why do you need 23 when one will do the job and save a bunch of money? Now, if you're writing for Michael Bay and he's bought the script, he's directing it, you know that, okay, include the 23 explosions, but more than likely you're trying to break in. So if you need an explosion, that's fine. You just gotta make sure it's worth it. So let me give you a couple of loose guidelines to consider. Now, there's always exceptions, but if you look at the items I'm about to list and realize that you have more of the expensive ones in your script, you might want to consider going back through your script and seeing how you can modify the expenses. In general, night is more expensive than day. You just need more stuff to shoot at night. You need more people, more equipment. You just need more stuff. Night's more expensive than day. Moving on. Public is more expensive than private. So the more public the venue, the more expensive. A mall is more expensive than a strip mall or a single storefront. Okay, backyards are really cheap. Remote is more expensive than accessible. Now, there's always exceptions to this one, but remote locations in the woods shot during the day would be cheap, right? Well, maybe. I mean, if you have a bunch of them, so your film takes place in a wilderness area, it might be cheaper overall. But if you only have a few scenes in the woods because they are hard to get to and hard to get the whole cast and crew and all the equipment to, okay, that makes it a challenge. It makes it more expensive. If it's in the woods at night, okay, you can kind of cheat that one a little bit, right? Because I don't have to go out into some remote mountain range. I can just film it in a wooded parking lot in Nashville or Atlanta. But if you're in a house, okay, that's easier, right? It's accessible. And one thing you need to keep in mind is how the scene will be lit. Will they use natural light, the sun, or will they be plugging in lights? When you start plugging stuff in, it gets more expensive. So this one's a bit tricky. If you have a lot of scenes in a remote area, that might be okay because you're kind of got everybody's all out there. If you've only got a few scenes in a remote area, that's probably going to be a little more expensive. Big is more expensive than small. Okay, hopefully this one just makes sense. A bigger home is more expensive to rent than a smaller home. Okay, it's just the way it is. Bigger is more expensive than smaller. Moving on. Kids are more expensive than adults, and the younger the child, the more expensive the child. There are rules and guidelines that must be followed when children are on a set, and this is why most shows that have teenage roles are played by actors who are 18, 19, 20. A 17-year-old is more expensive than an 18-year-old. So if you have a 12-year-old in your script, you've got a character who's 12, consider aging them up to around 15 or 16. So if the script gets made, they can cast an 18-year-old and save some money. Animals are expensive, period. Every time an animal is involved, you have just added in 3 big costs. The animal itself, yep, because you got to pay to rent the animal. The animal's trainer, because they must be there, and a big insurance hit to protect the animal, the trainer, and for liability in case the animal harms any of the cast or crew or equipment while on the set. So if you don't need an animal in your script, get rid of them. And I know it was sad, but the filmmakers of John Wick saved a lot of money by killing the puppy. Okay, I'm sorry, but they did. Harsh truths, baby. Moving vehicles are more expensive than parked vehicles. Now, this mostly impacts cars because a lot of new writers include scenes with people talking inside of a moving car. That's expensive to shoot. There are trailers that have to get bought and hitched and all the gear. There's a lot of gear. There's permits to close streets or you quarantine off streets a little bit. There's extra pay to police officers for escorting vehicles and ensuring the road is safe. And depending on the scene, you can literally save hundreds of thousands of dollars just by having the characters engage in their conversation before they get into the car or before the car drives off instead of in the car while it's moving. And if you start including other moving vehicles, planes, trains, boats, helicopters, just multiply whatever the moving car cost was gonna be by 4 or 5 and you might be close. And if those planes or helicopters have props that are turning, okay, add another 0 to the check. If the train is moving toward the actors, yep, add a 0 to the check. Anyone in water is more expensive than anyone dry, because when you start filming actors in water, there's a host of costs that get added in. Now you might think, well, yeah, we have to waterproof the camera, but it's not just that. It's all the gear. And if it's at night, I mean, how well does water and electricity go together? Yeah, not so much. More zeros. Plus, if actors or crew are in the water, you will need at minimum a lifeguard or several on set. And if you're in an existing body of water, the ocean, lake, pond, you'll also more than likely need a rescue diver or a few on set. This is why boats are expensive. If someone could go overboard, or if a stunt person is going overboard because of a fight on a moving boat, yeah, you might have just broken the budget. Crowds are more expensive, even if you're just filming passersby. Getting a permit to film in a public space with lots of people is expensive. If those people are all extras, okay, the going rate for an extra is about $175 a day. So if you have 200 for 1 day of filming. 200 extras, you just need them 1 day. It's not that big of a deal. Yeah, congratulations. You just spent $35,000 of the budget, and we haven't even fed them yet, which we're required to do. And we haven't had to clothe them yet because we're shooting a film set in 1940s New York and modern fashion won't work. And while we're on the topic, even though this one's not totally related to setting, we should still talk about it anyway. More actors are more expensive than fewer. And while this might seem like a no-brainer, there are specific rules for how much an actor gets paid, and it has to do with how many words they say. I'll just short this one here by saying, if you have more than 13 or 14 speaking roles for your film is too expensive. Reduce the number of speaking parts. And no, having one character suddenly be deaf and use sign language is not a workaround. Words apply to sign language too. And you can't forget about time. The more removed you are from the modern era, the more expensive. There is a caveat though. If there are people alive who remember what that past time was like, it's more expensive than if the setting is much older. Most of you can probably imagine what the 1960s looked like. Either you were alive or you've seen plenty of pictures of the 1960s. But what were the 1400s like? Castles, knights, farmers, but you've got a lot of leeway there because no one really remembers that. At least more leeway than you do with the 1960s. This means that the future is often just as expensive as the past. You'll have to create things, build things, fabricate costumes, just like you would for the 1400s. But if the future is, say, 50 years from now, okay, you won't have to do too much. Kind of like with the 60s. You'll still have to do some, but not a whole lot. So back to your question, how can I understand budget if I don't know how much things cost? The best way is to use the comparisons that I've just given. Don't worry about figuring out exactly how much things cost, but if you have a lot of scenes at night, a few in remote areas, a few with a bunch of extras, and you have 20 speaking parts, and some of those conversations take place inside of moving cars, you have a more expensive movie than you thought. The solution? Just modify the settings for where those scenes take place. Maybe for your whole film, but more than likely you only need to do it for the impacted scenes. And one other tip, remember film is a visual medium. We go to movies to see things we don't normally see. So if you have a bunch of scenes set in a house, consider where else you could set those scenes in a way that doesn't negatively impact the budget. Because when a reader is reading your script, they get to the end, they love the story. Okay, one of the things they're going to do is to create a budget report or budget impact report or whatever their company calls them. And they aren't saying, oh, this is a $37.5 million movie. That's not what they're doing because they don't know all the exact cost either. What they're doing is they're saying, hey, this movie could be shot for under $2 million, or this is a movie in the $50 to $100 million range. They're just gonna give it a range. So if you want a shot at getting your script bought and you aren't paying attention to the budgetary implications of the settings, you might be shooting yourself in the foot. But that's not the only thing you gotta think about. There's actually 5 questions that producers are asking when considering your script. I mean, budget is one, and it's a small piece of one, but if you wanna know what other critical questions producers are asking that you must be thinking about when you write your screenplay, you can watch this video right here. Thank you for watching. Don't forget about all the links and buttons below, especially Jumpstart, and when you tell a story that matters. See you later.